I'm audible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So, very good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Luigi for putting this together and his team who have made all this effort to bring us together here. I think it is really a marvelous opportunity because it's a learning experience for me and very educative and inspiring, and I presume also for all of you. And I congratulate all the speakers, who have been working in their own field with so much of passion, which we have seen over here in their performance. And I find that everyone has been mentioned. Everyone has mentioned about some kind of a crisis and also a way out of it. But generally there has been this concern and a little bit of dismay at the impact of science and technology on our lives. So I thought that just to change our mood, let's look at the positive side of technology and see how, in fact, love is an enabler in one's life to counter all the intolerance, the terrorism, and the bigotry that exists in the world today. And that is why I'm going to speak on cross-cultural marriages. This is an ongoing project for me. I've been working on it for decades because it's a very difficult subject in India. Now, what do I mean by cross-cultural marriage? A lot of work in the world has been done on mixed marriages. You could have inter-religious, inter-caste, intercultural marriage. But the marriage that I have studied is called international marriage in India, because only a few articles exist on this theme, where one spouse is an Indian and the other, a non-Indian or a non-native. So that is my definition of this marriage. And we find that owing to globalization and modernization, the travel has increased in the world, and especially in India. We find people travel to visit, to study, to work, and also there is so much of migration happening all over the world. So as a result of which, cross-cultural marriages are actually on the rise. And so in India there is no book that exists on this theme, and that is why I'm doing this work. And the other reason why I am so much involved in this project is because my younger sister was involved in a cross-cultural marriage or an international marriage. She was the first Indian girl to marry a Mongolian. And unfortunately, she died very young because there were no medical facilities available in Mongolia, and she came back to India and it was too late. So she, at the end of her life, before she passed away, she asked me to do this work. And so I'm paying homage to her by doing this work. But today, I will not take too much time, and I will leave say 10 to 15 minutes for discussion, because I need your feedback in order to carry on with my work too. So I'm briefly going to go through this work and bring out only the salient features. And this now, international marriage or cross-cultural marriage needs to be contextualized in our present-day society. And we as sociologists, talk about two different kind of societies. One is the settlement society and the other is a civilizational society. So for example, India is seen as a civilizational society, whereas if you go and migrate and settle down in America, that is seen as a settlement society. So it depends where you are living. So the result of your marriage or the consequences of your marriage will vary according to where you are living. So territory in fact becomes very significant in cross-cultural marriage. The other sociological context that we need to keep in mind is modernity. You know, the dilemmas of modernity that we are all going through. Everyone has mentioned about them in some way or the other. But we people talk in terms of, abstraction. Abstraction is the biggest problem in our life, in the sense there is so much of anomie, which Durkheim has talked about, or there is so much of bureaucratization in our lives, which Weber has talked about, or there is so much of alienation in our lives, which both Marx and Freud, have talked about. And the other dilemma is that of futurity. Many people have been talking about the future, that we need to focus on the future to have a bright future. And in this whole process, we forget to live now. Then this whole process of individuation which is going on because of modernity. This is the whole atomization that is going on. And in India, we see how the joint family is also breaking into a nuclear family. And the nuclear units are again, breaking down. And there are single-headed families. So at a social level, this atomization is going on. Then liberation. That is another dilemma of our times. Liberation both at the personal level and at the societal level. People are fighting for their freedom, their inside freedom and their outside freedom. And countries want to become independent, and they are becoming. Many are still, under domination. And the final one is secularization. So this is where the role of science and technology has played, you could say, a very ambivalent role, in the sense that it has led to the desacralization in the lives of people. And all the secular people thought they can bring the humanity together by these universal values. It's a very great project. But as Lyotard has also mentioned, that at the same time, we are seeing the assertion of ethnicity and our unconscious self happening at the same time. So how do we handle that? So this is again leading to a process of religiosity, or you could say spirituality. I would use the word spirituality. So this quest for spirituality is on the rise, even in the times of secularization. If I look at the academic work which has been done on marriage, historically speaking, only men have worked on it. So we have anthropologists like Malinowski, Richard Evans Pritchard, Ratcliffe Brown, who worked on the functionalist type of rules, laws and affiliation patterns, or sociologists who have worked on the changing family and household patterns, and the feminists have worked on the structuring role of gender in all aspects of life, such as Shirley Ardner, Betty Friedan and Anne Oakley. But no one has looked at the lived experience of the actual people involved in family or marriage. And that is why in my study I have adopted a phenomenological approach, and I'm looking at the lived experiences of my actors, which I look at the subjective dimension. By subjective dimension, I mean the internal reality of the mind as reflected in the consciousness of these individual social actors and the meaning that they attach to it. From my research experience, I used to use the method of oral autobiographical narratives, and I found that to be a very, very tedious process. So in this work, I have adopted another method of collecting my data, which is the written autobiographical narrative. And I've given my subjects enough time to work on this so that they can actually think about their lives and come out with something very, very, insightful. Plus interviews. So I have interviewed, I have done about 30 in-depth case studies, but I have data around, let's say, around 100, cases of people who have been in these marriages or are in the marriages. And what is the area of my study? I have collected data from India, Europe, and North America. That's why it is taking me so long. And what are the main questions that I have raised? What makes marriages cross-cultural? Who marries into other cultures? What makes these marriages special or unique? What are the differences between expectation and reality? How is the chasm between self and the other negotiated? Or how does the self become the other? Why are these marriages harder than the other kind of, in inverted commas, regular marriages? And what are the potential trouble spots? And what are the implications of such marriages for children and their identity? This is a very, very important question which comes up. In brief, I will say that there are 5 kinds of people, who are involved in these kind of marriages. I've called them rebels, romantics, internationals, compensators, and experimentalists. Rebels are the ones, who, for example, in India, people who have been protesting against their culture, they don't want to follow the dowry system, etc. So they could be rebelling against their customs. Then you have the romantics, who look at the exotic others and they get fascinated by them. Or you have the internationals, these are the diplomats, academics, or the military people who are traveling, who get exposed to, outsiders. Or you have the compensators. These are the people who like to see their better half in the outsider, the other, somebody from abroad, because it enhances their status. So I'll give you an example there in India. If you look at the marriage websites, thanks to technology, we have these shadi.coms, marriage.coms, so many websites are there where arranged marriages, are happening. And it is very clearly mentioned there that we want a fair complexion girl. So nobody wants to go for a dark complexion girl in marriage. So that is where you find sometimes some of the girls, they like to marry a foreigner. They just bypass, the culture. They bypass all these websites. And finally, you have these experimentalists who also believe in some kind of openness, and they see the other culture as a challenge for their growth, and they like to, experiment in their life. They can afford to experiment, in other words. And the other thing I find is that these marriages in India, most of the times it's men who bring the foreign wives or the non-native wives to India. And there are only a handful of Indian women who have married foreign men or non-native men, and they have settled in India. Most of these women have migrated where the men are from. So just a handful of Indian women who have brought the husbands back to India. And that's because I think of the class background. They came from very well-to-do backgrounds. They could afford to bring these men in. On the other hand, you find that women actually have migrated Or it's only the well-to-do men who have brought in the wives, and the wives have stayed back. And there are no statistics available, but about 50% of these marriages in India have broken down. That's the other data that I could collect. At the same time, I will also mention that there are these exceptional cases in India that happen too, where nothing matters, when it's a question about love. There is a very beautiful novel, I don't know if anybody has read it, An Indian Attachment by Sarah Lloyd. So where there is this English woman who comes to India, she gets into a taxi at the airport, and she finds the taxi driver so handsome that she falls in love, and she marries him. And then she goes to his village in Punjab, and she lives there for 2 years. She calls him jungli, a barbarian actually. But, she changes, and it's like an anthropological study of the village life in India. But this marriage didn't last, so it broke down. But it's a beautiful novel that she has done. And there was another very fascinating case of another lady who got into the taxi, and a taxi man was very handsome, but he was totally uneducated. But this woman, she just fell in love with this man, and she's still living there. She's doing the travel business, and she is supporting her husband, and they're living happily. So there are all kinds of cases. Mm-hmm. So there are these two, sorry?
I said, let's go and become a taxi driver.
Okay. So in fact, I found there were these, three kind of stages that these couples went through when you study them over a period of time. First is, the honeymoon stage, then you have the adjustment stage, and then the third one is the settlement stage. So most of these marriages, break down during the adjustment phase. And in India, these marriages broke down because the women felt that when they were, for example, in Europe or America, the men behaved in a totally different way. And when they came back to India, somehow their gene changed, they thought. Because they became so family oriented, and it was the mother consciousness that prevailed. And the mother-in-law became more dominant. So they totally were lost over there. And many women have also felt like a stranger in a strange land. This is what the expression that they used. Coming back to the trouble spots in these marriages. Believe me, it's an endless conflict, and it is an endless contestation going on in such a marriage. It is regarding value systems, it's regarding dress, belief, rituals, food, death, divorce, counseling. I'll give you some examples for death. There was this American lady, she just could not accept the fact that the corpse, the dead body was lying on the floor, that from the bed actually they removed the person to the floor, and there were flies sitting on the corpse. So it was unthinkable for her. She went into a depression because over there they cremate, they don't bury. All these things become so prominent you cannot imagine. Things of language, communication. This is the most difficult thing in a cross-cultural marriage. You have to learn each other's language, otherwise it creates problems. And I will give you one extreme example of a case. This was from Sweden. So the Swedish lady was married to an Indian, and they were living there. So she said she was scared that in the old age, if her husband comes down with Alzheimer's, she was afraid that he will speak his native tongue and he will not speak Swedish. So how will she understand him? Because what happens is you go into your past when you have Alzheimer's, you forget your current knowledge. But These marriages are also affected by a wider socio-political context and the immigration laws in countries. So that also sometimes determines who you can marry and whom you can bring into the country. So the role of state becomes very significant. There are restricted entries in certain countries. And you can't get a residential permit everywhere. So in India, for example, many women had expressed the fear that they will never be able to own any property. So they felt very insecure. It's only recently that the laws have been changed. They can own property. So what I'm going to do is, I am going to give you a taste of what these people have actually felt about their lives. Some of the cases. I think that will be more interesting, because otherwise you ask me questions and I will respond to your queries. There is so much, but I think this should be kind of enough to stimulate you. So these are just excerpts from the interviews. This is a second generation Indian woman in the UK. I also want to mention that in Europe and America, the second generation Indians have a tendency to marry foreigners more rather than the first generation Indians. Because the cultures are changing there, the way they are being raised, it's very different. So a second generation Indian woman in the UK relates, I quote, "I did not have the conventional Indian girl's education whereby you left school at 16, started some kind of job and activity, and thought about getting a marriage organized, because we still have arranged marriages in India. I was very fortunate to have parents who thought getting a good education was the highest priority. My parents did not put me under any pressure, although they did think when I was about 22 years old, they should show me a few suitable Indian boys and I could think about marriage. I did see a couple of boys. There was nothing wrong with these boys. I only got a glimpse of them anyway. But I felt an arranged marriage was just not for me. I wanted to fall in love, and actually there was very little possibility of me falling in love with an Indian because I hardly knew any. And the fact that my parents did not insist on an arranged marriage explains why it was very likely I would end up with a mixed marriage. Throughout our marriage, I don't think we have experienced any major cultural problems. This is because nobody apart from my mother is religious. She has had to make the biggest adjustment. In her old age, having an extended family would have been better for her. My husband's parents are fantastic, but their English philosophy is one of leave and let be. This has its pros and cons when it comes to families sharing things. And believe me, this marriage has succeeded because this lady is more English than the English. And in India, these marriages have succeeded because some of the foreign wives are more Indian than the Indians. I give you an example of our celebrity lady, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who was married to our ex-Prime Minister, and she is from Italy. And she's more Indian than the Indians. We never cover our head, or, we don't do things that she does. So, these people really have to socialize themselves into the culture completely, immerse themselves sometimes, more than we regular people do. In another story of an Indian man, one can get a glimpse at and understand who marries out and why. I quote, "The attraction towards a woman from another culture for somebody coming from a middle-class family growing in a tradition-bound city like Varanasi was simply a case of attraction, discovering the unknown, and ease. Ease because of all the taboos attached to a boy or girl going around in our Indian society. Growing up protected, I had the idea of growing up and marrying a girl who would be selected by my parents, and I would live all my life with the same person. However, changing times and the liberal thoughts of parents gave me the opportunity to go out and look for myself, which quickly resulted into heartbreaks and lost ideologies. Traveling worldwide, I met my wife on an airplane, she being also a world traveler. As chance would have it, we were staying at the same hotel. One thing led to another. A connection was made, and both being on the path searching, found each other acceptable, and our relationship became a jet-setting affair. I came from a family with its own cultural struggle, namely, my father being from a South Indian traditional business Brahmin family and my mother from a poor Bengali family. Living in Switzerland has not been easy and is never going to be easy. It is a cold society and people don't come to you just like that without an appointment. If I become fussy, then it would be difficult for me to cope with life here, but it would be the same for my wife if she were living in India, where every vegetable shop or cab driver will discriminate and may cheat too. Inverted commas close. Discussing the problems in a cross-cultural marriage, an Indian husband says, I quote, if the Indian husband buckles into the baggage of his close family, relatives, parents, friends, etc., then it has a major negative impact on the marriage. As long as the grey areas between the spouses is kept to a minimum, these marriages can grow and living in India can be a pleasure. Easy to say but difficult to do, as the Indians believe in chalta hai, that means everything goes. Another Indian husband who returned to India proclaimed, I quote, I was fully accepted in Holland because I learned the language and acted as Dutch as possible. They felt no gap as I was best of friends with my mother-in-law. We enjoyed having little skirmishes. She was very bourgeois, while I had, in her eyes, outspoken leftist views. After returning to India, my wife understood and tolerated many customs which were bizarre to her. To name just a few, wailing loudly and demonstratively over someone's death, visiting other people's homes without prior information, the show of modesty by refusing offered food a dozen times before accepting it. So,
10 minutes left.
Okay. Okay, then the last point I want to say is, if there were so many difficulties, why is it that people still opt for such a marriage? That's because they see an opportunity for self-growth over there. And most of the couples answered that the children were the best gift in such a marriage, to have bicultural children, because they were the third culture kids. They could feel at home everywhere in the world. Just to summarize. But let me tell you, the children really went through a lot of identity crisis because of these marriages. Even the color of the hair, the skin, going to school in India, not being part of the crowd, it was traumatic for them. I will just read one quote from a child. I quote, so the cross-cultural parental union, with all its challenges and fears and uncertainties, its constant changes of location and diet and climate and people, all served as an ideal, though initially painful, milieu in which a cross-fertilization of worldviews, tastes, sounds, sight, images and human beings, in my experience, produced a broadness and richness which I enjoy today. Yet, too much changes and moves can create fear and insecurity. I'd experienced so many dislocations or relocations and travels that I probably craved a secure home base. I was constantly worried that I would not be collected from school by my mother and would utter the constant refrain on the way to school, in quotes, will you collect me, unquote. I would like to end with this last quotation by Piku Iyer, who is a very famous Indian author. He has really described this beautifully, his marriage and where he feels, or what is home. The core of affinity is mysterious. We have been talking about mystery. So love is the biggest mystery, even according to Professor Nash, if you have seen the movie The Beautiful Mind. when he gets the Nobel Prize, this was his sentence. Um, the core of affinity is mysterious. I, as someone of Indian ancestry born in and educated in England, officially resident in California and living for the past definitions. Why did I choose my wife Hiroko when there are 10 million other women with dark silky hair in Japan? Why do I feel kinship with Japan itself when I have no formal connection with it and can barely speak the language? Why do I keep dreaming of a place I visited once in California 25 years ago, and never of the places that surround me daily? I feel that knowing things often reduces our encounter with them. It's a beautiful line, and does insufficient respect to all we will ever know. Home is not the place where you are born, but the place where you become yourself. It is not a physical place, but an emotional, even a metaphysical place, made up of the friendships and passions and values you carry around with you wherever you happen to be in the world. It's got less and less to do with a piece of soil and more to do with a piece of soul. It's something invisible, internal, and portable. Quotes closed. So I will say that today, of course, many people get into relationships with foreigners, but there are only very few, or the so-called hero or the hero and the heroine, who will exchange rings and will take the step of a cross-cultural marriage. But I want to end with one last thing. We have been talking about the mystery, and in our Indian tradition, there was this question asked in Mahabharata, the epic Mahabharata in India, to the Pandavas, the 5 brothers, the famous 5 brothers. I think they have been sentenced to death, but then they approached the gods and they wanted to be saved. So they were told that if you can answer this question, then you will be granted your life. And the question by the gods was, what is the greatest mystery on earth? So the first 4 brothers gave all sorts of answers and they had to die. But the oldest brother, Yudhishthir, was supposed to be the wisest of them all. And his answer was, the greatest mystery on earth is, we all know that we are going to die. Everyone else also dies. But we feel that we will always be there. That is the greatest mystery. So then all the 5 brothers were granted life. So the question about awareness and consciousness, which came up in this conference, I want to briefly touch upon that too. Consciousness is of something or in itself, as has been mentioned in the paper, or for something. Whereas awareness, which has been called choiceless awareness by Krishnamurti, is something that happens in a very spontaneous way. You're not conscious of it. I think this is a very subtle difference. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Relationships now more and more Indian and other international relationships all exist all across the globe. But you said the marriage is still something that is not happening very often. And I wonder, from my personal experience studying with a lot of Indians, is the stance on marriage, the importance of marriage, is it still as strong or as important as it used to be? Because in my personal experience, especially Indian women and men who went abroad for study, even though they were married at home, were living a very liberal life.
Yeah, marriage is still very important for most of the Indians. You have to put it in a proper context. Which Indians are you talking about? Rural India, urban India? Huh? Urban. Yeah, so there is a certain section of Indians in the urban areas. People are very liberal over there. They live with each other. But they also go back home and accept an arranged marriage. I have had friends at the most radical university living with each other. They've gone back home and accepted even dowry, and they call themselves revolutionaries. So this is the biggest contradiction in India. You're leading a double life in India. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. Yeah. Yeah? Oh.
I am a Persian man and Englishman at the same time, I hope. My wife is English. In a few days' time, we are going to celebrate our 45th wedding anniversary in July. And we have been together for 47 years. I just want to say, in any intercultural marriages, intercivilizational marriages, if you promise from the first day that you meet each other and you try to become one, practicing loving kindness, truly remain in love, intermarriages, intercultural marriages will work. And one point I want to make, with your permission, I want to remember our parents. When Annie's parents, Catholic, British, very authentic, old-fashioned, they saw this hippie guy coming with Annie from Oxford, with the hair to here, and my trousers with the bottom this wide, and my high-heel shoes, and I said to them, hi, cool, and all the rest of it. They accepted me. And when I wrote to my father as oldest son, I said, Father, because in Persian culture, you address the question to your father, but it is mother who makes the decision. So I wrote, Father, I know I'm the oldest son, but I have fallen in love with this English girl, and she's Catholic, and she's practicing Catholic, and her parents the same, and they would be very happy if we get married in a Catholic church. And I was worried to death what the answer might be. Anyway, after 3-4 weeks, the letter arrived back from Tehran, and I opened it, shaking my belief, and my father had written, Cameron, first of all, congratulations. My father was a Sufi. Cameron, first of all, congratulations. You have fallen in love. That's the gift from God. Second, you have fallen in love with a girl. My father passed away. You have fallen in love with a girl who is religious, who is a Catholic. There is no difference between our mosque and her church. Tell us when the wedding is. We are all coming to England to celebrate it with you. So the family accepted us, and that grounded us in strength and confidence to go through many ups and downs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think you have... I think you have raised a very crucial point. You know, people have talked about the parental support, because even today, I think in England, you have honor killings when such marriages happen. So it's very, very important to get your parents' support in any marriage in India, I think.
I have a question. I'm wondering if you think that cross-cultural marriage is going to be the future of our global society?
I think so. It will be. In fact, this is the only solution. It's going to bring people together. It's going to bring cultures together. This is a bridge, you know, that will bring cultures together that have been divided till today. This is the hope for humanity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.